It was a gray, cold morning as the fog rolled over the forested hills of the Eastern Front, an oppressive, almost unnatural mist that swallowed everything in its path, concealing the trenches, barbed wire, and the distant rumble of artillery that had become a constant heartbeat of war. And as the German soldiers trudged through the damp underbrush, their boots sinking slightly into the frost-covered earth, a strange sound began to pierce the monotony of muted gunfire. A melody so incongruous with the landscape of death that it made the hairs on their necks stand on end, drifting through the mist like a ghostly whisper. Faint at first, indistinct, yet unmistakably deliberate, the notes rising and falling with a rhythm that seemed almost too orderly for the chaos around them. And as they strained their ears, trying to identify the source, a chilling realization began to take hold. This was not the sound of birds, not the wind through the trees, not the hum of engines, but music, deliberately played, hauntingly clear, emanating from somewhere just beyond the reach of their vision. And the officers, normally impervious to superstition or fear, exchanged uneasy glances, the tension palpable, the fog seeming to thicken in response, wrapping around them like a suffocating shroud. And as the soldiers adjusted their grip on rifles, scanning every shadow and movement in the gray void, the music grew louder, its haunting tones carrying over the frozen ground. A melody that was almost playful yet sinister, teasing the edges of comprehension while demanding attention. And in that moment, the mind instinctively prepares for danger. For a sound this deliberate, this out of place, in a landscape dominated by war, could only mean one thing: an approaching enemy, a trap, a confrontation that would come without warning and leave no room for hesitation. And as the notes echoed through the mist, faint shapes began to emerge, dark forms shifting and moving in the distance, the faint glint of metal catching what little light penetrated the fog. And the soldiers froze, the world narrowing to the interplay of shadow, sound, and intuition, each heartbeat echoing in their ears, a drumbeat against the foreboding symphony. As the melody continued, deceptively gentle, masking the deadly purpose that lay behind it, a carefully orchestrated illusion designed to lure, confuse, and terrify. And in those moments, the tension built to a crescendo, the fog thickened, muffling footsteps and concealing threats. And then, like a hammer striking the senses, the unmistakable sound of tank engines began to rumble through the landscape. A mechanical growl that shattered the fragile calm, vibrating through the soil, through the boots of the men, through the air itself, and the contrast between the music and the approaching war machines created a surreal, almost hallucinatory tension, the mind struggling to reconcile the melody that promised beauty with the reality of the looming destruction. And as the first outlines of armored silhouettes emerged through the fog, massive and ominous, rolling toward them with a deadly inevitability, the soldiers' training kicked in, yet even the most disciplined men felt the primal fear of facing an unstoppable force. And the fog seemed to become a living entity, rising and falling with the engines, swirling in patterns that disoriented, concealed and revealed in equal measure. While the music continued, a haunting, almost mocking prelude to the storm, intertwining with the growl of metal and treads to create an auditory landscape that was simultaneously mesmerizing and terrifying. And as the soldiers took positions, aimed rifles, and braced themselves, the tension reached a level that transcended ordinary fear, merging with disbelief, awe, and the instinctive recognition of approaching annihilation. And the melody, once ethereal and distant, now seemed to guide the tanks, a signal or psychological weapon, each note harmonizing with the rumble of engines as if orchestrating the advance. And within the minds of the men, questions and panic were replaced by pure survival instinct, their senses hyper-aware of every detail, the faintest silhouette, the smallest shift in fog density, the rhythmic vibration of the ground through their boots, the whisper of metal scraping on frost, and the subtle but relentless increase in noise and mass as the tanks drew closer, each meter forward bringing the impossibility of resistance into stark clarity, while the melody persisted, haunting, strange, and maddening in its persistence, teasing the soldiers with the grotesque beauty of sound amidst the horror of inevitable confrontation. And in this surreal interlude, time seemed to stretch, the seconds elongating into lifetimes as each man processed fear, strategy, instinct, and the unrelenting presence of death approaching with mechanical inevitability. And the first shells began to arc through the fog, bursting in muted explosions that sent up mist and shattered branches, mingling with the music in a cacophony that seemed almost choreographed, as if the enemy orchestrated not only the assault, but the psychological terror that accompanied it. And as shouts, commands, and gunfire erupted in rapid succession, the soldiers realized that the day would be marked not just by combat, but by an almost surreal interplay of beauty, terror, and the mechanical precision of destruction, and every step, every sound, every note of music and roar of engines combined into a narrative of suspense, setting the stage for the unfolding confrontation, a sequence of events that would push human perception, fear, and endurance to their absolute limits, a story that demanded attention from the very first second, capturing the mind and heart of any observer, drawing them into the fog, into the music, and ultimately into the terrifying advance of armored might, ensuring that from this first moment onward, every heartbeat, every sensory detail, and every shred of human instinct was engaged. As the German soldiers faced a scenario that was as psychologically haunting as it was physically lethal, a tale of war, strategy, fear, and awe that would compel viewers to witness the full, impossible unfolding of music, mist, and armored destruction. As the fog thickened and the haunting melody lingered like a phantom in the frozen air, the German soldiers felt an almost surreal disorientation. The mist distorting shapes, exaggerating sounds, and turning every shadow into a potential threat, while the rhythmic growl of approaching tanks vibrated through the ground beneath their boots. A mechanical heartbeat of inevitability that contrasted grotesquely with the ethereal music that seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere at once. And as they advanced cautiously, rifles ready, eyes straining through the gray haze, the terrain itself seemed to conspire against them. The frost-laden underbrush snagging boots, branches reaching like skeletal hands, and every movement producing muted cracks that sounded like thunder in the quiet. Oppressive fog, while the officers, normally authoritative and composed, found their command challenged by the surreal environment, their voice carried by the mist but distorted, echoing back in unintelligible fragments, and the soldiers' training, honed for precision, coordination, and battlefield clarity, suddenly felt almost useless against the overwhelming sensory confusion. As the fog and music worked together to mask distance, conceal movements, and amplify fear, and then, from the gray nothingness, the first silhouettes of tanks emerged, their forms monstrous and impossibly large in the haze, metal glinting faintly, treads grinding over frozen soil, engines growling a menacing chorus that shook the ground and rattled nerves, while the music, seemingly synchronized with their advance, created a surreal auditory layering that blurred the line between hallucination and reality. And as the tanks rolled forward, the soldiers instinctively took cover behind trees, crumbling walls and whatever debris could shield them, but the fog rendered judgment nearly impossible. Concealment illusory, and every movement, every breath carried the potential for instant detection and annihilation. And in those terrifying moments, the first artillery rounds from the enemy tanks arced through the fog, explosions erupting with deafening concussions, earth shaking, branches splintering, frost flying, while shrapnel tore through cover with lethal precision, forcing the men to adapt rapidly, shifting positions, communicating in terse commands, and relying on split-second intuition rather than measured strategy. And amidst this chaos, the psychological impact of the music became pronounced, a haunting, almost malevolent counterpoint to the mechanical destruction, its notes eerily melodic yet terrifying in context, as if the sound itself mocked their predicament, creating an atmosphere where fear was amplified, courage tested, and survival dependent on both skill and a degree of luck that no training could provide. And as the tanks drew closer, the fog briefly parted to reveal the grotesque scale of their advance, the soldiers frozen for a heartbeat by the realization of how outmatched they were, yet instinctively snapping back into defensive positions, firing rifles and machine guns, attempting to slow an inexorable force that could not be deterred by small arms. And in the midst of gunfire, shrapnel, and the groaning of metal under strain, the soldiers experienced the full spectrum of human response to imminent annihilation. adrenaline-fueled focus, paralyzing fear, tactical improvisation, and moments of almost surreal clarity where instinct alone guided decisions. While around them the fog seemed alive, curling, twisting, revealing, and concealing in turn, amplifying the eerie effect of the music and obscuring the scale and speed of the armored advance, creating an environment in which every sense was challenged, every perception questioned, and the margin for error reduced to the barest sliver. And as the first tank breached what remained of the defensive line, crushing obstacles, tearing through makeshift barricades, and creating chaos with every grinding tread, the soldiers were forced into rapid adaptation, moving strategically, firing where possible, and using terrain to their advantage, all while the soundscape, the discordant combination of music and mechanical menace, warped perception, accelerated heartbeats, and heightened the terror to almost unbearable levels. And as the battle unfolded in this surreal mist, the soldiers realized that survival depended on coordination, improvisation, and an almost preternatural awareness of every micro-detail, a shadow that betrayed movement, a faint reflection of metal, the subtle vibration of the ground indicating the tank's proximity, and the moments between artillery bursts that allowed fleeting glimpses of opportunity, all of which were exploited with rapid precision, each decision potentially the difference between life and death. And the fog, the music, and the mechanical advance of armored behemoths combined to create a living tableau of terror, beauty, and lethal inevitability, a scenario that was as psychologically taxing as it was physically perilous, leaving the soldiers operating at the absolute limits of human endurance, focus, and reaction as the tanks continued to advance, firing relentlessly, crushing cover, and reducing the terrain to chaos. And amidst this hellish tableau, the soldiers maintained cohesion, courage, and tactical awareness, improvising strategies to delay, mislead, or survive the armored onslaught, while the music, still present in the eerie, surreal fog, added a psychological weight, an almost malevolent reminder that every advance was anticipated, every movement observed, every second a test of nerve and ingenuity. And as the first wave of tanks approached within striking distance, the soldiers prepared for a confrontation that would define the limits of human courage, tactical skill, and the terrifying interplay of perception and reality. A confrontation that merged fear, adrenaline, strategy, and improvisation into a continuous, unbroken flow of survival instinct and disciplined action, ensuring that every heartbeat, every micro-movement, every sensory input was used to maximum effect. And in this crucible, the story of the fog, the music, and the unstoppable tanks became a narrative of suspense, terror, and the extraordinary human will to survive. A story that compelled full engagement, total immersion, and unwavering attention, as the soldiers faced a combination of environmental distortion, psychological manipulation, and overwhelming mechanical force that together formed one of the most harrowing and surreal battle experiences imaginable. A sequence of events that demanded courage, skill, and a clarity of mind that few could achieve under normal circumstances. And yet, despite the near impossibility of the situation, the soldiers adapted, fought, and endured, their every action a testament to the raw human capacity to confront the unimaginable, survive the seemingly inevitable, and navigate a fog-shrouded battlefield where music and mechanized terror combined to create an unforgettable, suspense-filled crucible of war. As the lead tanks pushed forward through the thickening fog, crushing frost-laden brush and scattering debris with each grinding tread, the German soldiers found themselves in a surreal theater of war where sound, sight, and instinct intertwined in a deadly ballet, the haunting music still drifting through the mist as if orchestrating the advance of the armored nightmare, and the men, gripping their rifles and machine guns, moved with a mixture of trained precision and raw, instinctive survival ducking behind splintered trees, ruined fences and shattered walls, the cold biting through uniforms, smoke and frost mixing in the air to obscure vision, while every footstep and crack of frozen branches seemed amplified in the eerie quiet between the rumble of engines and the artillery's relentless punctuation, and as the first shells exploded near their positions, hurling frozen earth and wood into the air, The soldiers responded with improvisation born of necessity, shifting positions on the fly, coordinating suppressive fire, and exploiting micro-terrain features to delay the tank's inexorable advance. Each movement a gamble, each decision a tightrope walk over the chasm between life and death. And within this chaotic, almost hallucinatory environment, the officers' voices, distorted by fog and echoing oddly against the frozen landscape, cut through the auditory confusion like lifelines, issuing commands that were both precise and adaptable, guiding squads through zones of maximum danger, while the soldiers relied on heightened sensory awareness to detect the subtle vibrations, shifts in mist density, and faint glints of metal that signaled approaching armored targets. And as tanks maneuvered, firing with destructive accuracy, the soldiers exploited every available tactic, targeting weak points, luring armor into natural traps, using debris as improvised anti-tank obstacles, and coordinating small arms fire to harass crews within the vehicles. While the fog continued to both conceal and reveal, creating moments of terrifying uncertainty when tanks appeared suddenly from the mist or vanished just as quickly, amplifying fear while demanding rapid cognitive recalibration. And in these moments, the music, once haunting and ethereal, assumed a psychological weight unnervingly persistent, twisting with the mechanical growl of engines into a soundscape that toyed with perception, heightened stress, and demanded complete mental and physical engagement, compelling soldiers to react instinctively and strategically at once. And as the battle intensified, the fog itself seemed almost alive, curling around treads, branches, and human forms, creating a constantly shifting battlefield where perception, timing, and improvisation became paramount, while artillery and machine gun fire tore through the air, punctuated by the distant roar of secondary explosions as tanks destroyed obstacles and structures, and the soldiers, operating at the absolute edge of endurance, executed daring maneuvers, sprinting between cover, returning fire in microbursts, coordinating movements silently with gestures when the cacophony made speech impossible, and exploiting every subtle change in terrain, weather, and tank positioning to create the illusion of resistance against a seemingly unstoppable force. And as the armored advance pressed onward, crews inside the tanks responded with relentless determination, attempting to locate and neutralize threats, firing shells that screamed through fog and smoke, shattering cover and threatening to obliterate defensive positions. Yet the soldiers adapted, observing patterns, predicting moves, improvising countermeasures, and striking with precision in fleeting windows of opportunity. Each action a demonstration of human ingenuity under pressure, a ballet of survival where strategy, instinct, and courage collided in rapid succession. And the psychological strain on every man was immense, every heartbeat amplified in the mind, every sensory input dissected, interpreted, and used for survival, as moments stretched into what felt like eternities, and the fog, music, and relentless mechanical advance conspired to test limits of cognition, fear management, and endurance, creating a scenario where split-second decisions determined not just survival, but the effectiveness of the entire defensive effort. And yet, amidst the chaos, extraordinary acts of heroism emerged, with individual soldiers improvising traps, creating diversions, coordinating fire in ways that slowed tanks for precious seconds, and using their knowledge of terrain and enemy behavior to survive encounters that seemed impossible. While the music persisted, a constant eerie backdrop that lent a hallucinatory rhythm to every action, blurring the line between reality and psychological warfare. And as the battle unfolded in a dense fog of smoke, music, metal, and frost, the soldiers' resilience was tested repeatedly, pushing human endurance, focus, and courage to extremes, demanding a balance of intellect, instinct, and improvisation that few could sustain for long periods, and every micro-decision, from when to expose oneself to return fire to how to coordinate suppressive actions to protect comrades, carried the weight of life and death, reinforcing the surreal intensity of the engagement. And as tanks continued to maneuver, fire, and destroy, the soldiers relied on experience, training, and pure ingenuity to survive, adapting continuously, exploiting every fleeting advantage, and maintaining cohesion under conditions designed to shatter human resolve. All while the music persisted, threading through the chaos, a ghostly and haunting companion that heightened suspense. Fear and focus simultaneously, and as shells exploded, metal groaned and fog shifted. The soldiers fought not only for their lives but for every inch of territory, improvising tactics, maintaining situational awareness, and exploiting psychological and environmental conditions to create the slimmest possible margin for survival, culminating in moments of almost miraculous coordination, courage, and intuition that allowed some to evade destruction, survive tank assaults, and continue resistance despite overwhelming odds, while the battlefield itself seemed to stretch, compress, and distort in response to perception, fear, and the relentless interplay of sound, movement, and danger, a sensory crucible designed to test the limits of human ability, endurance, and focus, leaving those who survived not only scarred physically but marked indelibly by the psychological intensity, the surreal mixture of music, fog, and armored terror, and the story, already legendary in the making, demanded complete attention, total immersion, and engagement, as it illustrated the extraordinary resilience, improvisation, and heroism of men caught in one of the most harrowing, surreal, and deadly battle sequences imaginable. A confrontation where music, mist, and mechanized war merged into an unforgettable crucible of suspense, terror, and human endurance. As the fog thickened into an almost impenetrable gray shroud, the German soldiers braced themselves for what seemed an inevitable annihilation, the haunting melody still drifting like a ghostly companion through the mist, now intertwined with the grinding roar of tank engines and the staccato percussion of artillery fire. And in this surreal battlefield, every step forward became a calculated risk, each breath measured against the chaos of movement, noise, and fire, while frozen ground cracked under boots and treads, sending shards of ice and frost scattering into the fog like spectral sparks. And as the lead tanks approached within lethal range, the soldiers executed survival maneuvers honed under extreme pressure, moving in unison to exploit natural depressions in the terrain, concealing positions behind splintered trees and destroyed barricades, coordinating small arms fire to target vulnerable sections of enemy armor, and improvising anti-tank traps using debris, explosives, and whatever materials could be leveraged in moments of near-impossible creativity. And the fog, while initially a source of disorientation, became a tactical ally in fleeting windows, masking movements, creating illusions of absent forces, and allowing daring soldiers to approach, strike, and withdraw in a fluid dance of life and death, while the tank's destructive force continued to advance, hurling shells, tearing through obstacles, and obliterating cover with terrifying efficiency. Yet each maneuver, each explosion, each shifting shadow became a data point in the soldiers' hyperacute awareness, a micro-calculation of threat, opportunity, and survival. And the music, persistent and eerie, threaded through the chaos, a constant psychological undertone that seemed almost sentient, reinforcing tension, sharpening senses, and challenging focus, forcing soldiers to parse sound, movement, and instinct simultaneously, while every heartbeat and breath echoed the stakes of the moment, creating a sensory intensity that pushed cognition and reflexes to their limits. And as one tank's treads ground close to a defensive position, the soldiers executed a daring countermeasure, using improvised explosives to target the treads and suspension, a carefully timed detonation that sent shock waves through the mist, rattling armor, hurling frost and debris, and forcing the crew to react instantly, while rifle fire and grenades supplemented the effort, each soldier performing in perfect synchrony, instinctively understanding timing, distance, and lethal vulnerability in a ballet of chaos and precision. And as the fog swallowed and revealed the battlefield in rapid succession, tanks alternately vanished and reappeared like monsters emerging from a nightmare, each encounter a test of courage, adaptability, and ingenuity. And within this crucible, moments of almost miraculous survival unfolded, soldiers slipping through the gaps between advancing armored columns, using fog to mask movement, exploiting terrain anomalies to delay or misdirect tanks, and coordinating fire in microbursts to create confusion and slow destruction, while the continuous interplay of music, mist, and metal created a psychological rhythm that demanded total attention, split-second decisions, and near-superhuman endurance. And as the battle reached a pivotal point, The soldiers recognized a pattern in tank movements, a subtle, almost imperceptible rhythm in advance and fire that allowed daring individuals to anticipate trajectories, position explosives effectively, and inflict maximum damage, turning what had seemed an unstoppable onslaught into a series of calculated engagements, each decision sharpening the edge of survival, each micro-action rippling outward to influence the chaotic flow of battle. And as shells exploded, metal groaned, and fog shifted like a living entity, the soldiers' awareness and improvisation combined into extraordinary effectiveness, using every available tactic to stall, mislead, and destroy, while casualties, both physical and psychological, mounted, and yet the relentless focus, courage, and teamwork created moments of stunning effectiveness, illustrating human ingenuity against overwhelming odds. And in the midst of this deadly fog, soldiers emerged as heroes in microcosm, performing daring feats, dismantling advancing tanks with improvised charges, neutralizing firing positions, and rescuing comrades from near-certain death, all executed under the dual pressure of imminent destruction and the surreal, omnipresent music that threaded through the chaos like a living reminder of the impossible environment. And as one tank fell to a carefully executed trap, its crew scrambling amidst smoke and fire, the soldiers experienced a fleeting, almost intoxicating triumph, the fog momentarily lifting to reveal the scale of what had been accomplished, yet leaving them acutely aware that the battle was far from over, and every victory, every tank neutralized, required immediate adjustment, repositioning, and vigilance as the fog, music, and remaining armored forces continued to create an environment of relentless tension, where survival demanded unbroken focus, rapid improvisation, and total mental and physical engagement. And as the morning stretched into hours, the soldiers adapted continuously, exploiting weaknesses, observing patterns, coordinating movements, and maintaining cohesion under conditions designed to shatter resolve, all while the interplay of auditory, visual, and tactile stimuli, the growl of engines, explosion concussions, the shifting fog, and the haunting music, created a sensory crucible that tested endurance and sharpened instincts. And through these extreme conditions, the soldiers' extraordinary resilience, improvisation, and tactical acumen allowed them to turn the tide in localized engagements, create zones of temporary safety, and inflict meaningful damage on an otherwise overwhelming mechanized force, demonstrating human capability at the limits of survival, cognition, and courage. And as the fog continued to swirl, the music persisted, simultaneously disorienting, motivating, and focusing the men, embedding itself into the narrative of the battle, reinforcing the tension, and compelling viewers to experience every heartbeat, breath, and micro-decision. As the clash of humans and machines reached a level of intensity, suspense, and psychological complexity that demanded total engagement, total immersion, and unwavering attention, illustrating not only the lethal power of armored warfare, but also the extraordinary lengths to which trained, determined, and adaptable soldiers could push themselves to survive, resist, and prevail even in one of the most harrowing, fog-shrouded, music-haunted, and tank-driven battlefields imaginable. As the fog finally began to lift, revealing the twisted remnants of trees, shattered barricades, and scorched earth where the battle had raged, the German soldiers stood in a tense, almost surreal silence, the haunting melody that had accompanied the advance of the tanks now lingering like a spectral echo over the desolate landscape, blending with the groans of damaged machinery and the distant rumble of retreating armored columns. And each man, exhausted, bleeding, and shivering in the cold, surveyed the aftermath with a mixture of relief, disbelief, and lingering fear. For the fog had concealed not only the enemy, but the full scope of destruction, amplifying every sensory perception, every heartbeat, and every psychological strain. And as officers called roll, checking for casualties, injured, and missing, the men realized how close they had come to total annihilation, how every micro-decision, every instant of improvisation, and every act of courage had preserved not only their own lives, but the cohesion of their unit. And within this liminal space, between victory, survival, and horror, a profound awareness settled upon them, that they had endured a confrontation where music, mist, and mechanized terror had intertwined to create an almost hallucinatory battlefield, a crucible of human endurance, skill, and courage. And as soldiers helped comrades from cover, administered first aid, and attempted to make sense of the sequence of chaos, the psychological weight of what had transpired pressed upon them, their minds replaying the surreal combination of auditory cues, fog-obscured movement, artillery concussions, and armored menace, each sensory detail ingrained with terrifying clarity, while the melody, now faint and distant, seemed to mock, console, and haunt all at once, a reminder that the encounter had been orchestrated to test their limits of perception, fear, and instinct, and in that haunting quiet, the soldiers reflected on the extraordinary nature of survival, how each moment of split-second improvisation, tactical ingenuity, and instinctive courage had combined to tip the scales ever so slightly in their favor, allowing them to withstand what had initially seemed an overwhelming, unstoppable armored force. And as the fog continued to lift gradually, revealing distant smoke plumes, scattered debris, and tanks either disabled or withdrawing under coordinated counterattacks, the men absorbed the full gravity of the battle, a narrative of chaos and order, fear and heroism, improvisation and discipline, horror and relief, unfolding in a relentless torrent of action and perception, leaving an indelible impression on every survivor. And the music, now nearly gone, lingered as a ghostly motif, a psychological scar that tied together memory, fear, and triumph, embedding itself in their consciousness as a symbol of both the surreal terror they had faced and the extraordinary human resilience they had demonstrated. And in the distance, the horizon revealed faint signs of other units, movements that suggested reinforcements, continued threat, or simply the ongoing rhythm of war, reminding the men that survival was temporary, that victory was partial, and that the battle had imposed lessons in adaptability, coordination, and courage that would never be forgotten, while the fog itself, now retreating, seemed to leave behind a clarity that illuminated every detail of the aftermath. The frozen ground, splintered barricades, smoke-streaked trees, and the battered yet intact soldiers who had defied what had seemed an impossible mechanical onslaught, and as the first aid was administered, the injured carried to safety and the damaged positions assessed, a collective understanding emerged that they had survived not merely because of training or chance, but because of extraordinary human capacity to adapt, improvise, and persevere under conditions designed to overwhelm mind, body, and spirit, and the soldiers' camaraderie, trust, and shared experience crystallized in that moment into an unspoken bond, a recognition that they had endured an encounter unlike any other, a fog-shrouded, music-haunted, armored nightmare that had tested every facet of courage, perception, and survival. And as the day faded, the surviving men gathered briefly, taking stock of their losses, their narrow escapes, and the sheer improbability of their endurance, understanding that the story of this battle would be recounted for decades, studied for tactics, psychological impact, and human resilience, a tale where music and fog were as formidable as metal and fire, shaping not only immediate survival but memory, legend, and awe. And as evening settled over the battlefield, the last echoes of melody faded into the mist, leaving a haunting silence that resonated through the minds of those present, embedding a lasting suspense, a sense of wonder, and a profound understanding of the fragility, strength, and extraordinary capacity of humans to endure the impossible, compelling any observer, reader, or viewer to follow every heartbeat, every decision, and every harrowing moment as the German soldiers who had survived this extraordinary encounter with music, fog, and tanks became living witnesses to a combination of psychological manipulation, battlefield chaos, and heroic endurance that would forever define this chapter of war, leaving a final, unforgettable impression of suspense, awe, and human courage that demanded attention from the first note of music to the last retreating engine, sealing the story as an unbroken, immersive narrative that held viewers captive, riveted and emotionally invested, a lasting testament to the surreal, terrifying, and heroic reality of soldiers facing the unimaginable under conditions that defied comprehension, leaving them alive, changed, and forever marked by one of the most improbable, suspense-filled, and psychologically intense encounters in modern warfare.